Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to Professor Bossillon for the invitation to say some words during this colloquium, even from a distance through this video. It will not be perfect. I'm not used to that. I hope the sound will be correct, however, and that you will be able to perhaps grab some elements from the ideas I will share with you. The topic kindly allocated to me is about the articulations between UN measures and unilateral sanctions. Well, if you look at the title of this contribution, it's a bit misleading, perhaps it's a bit bizarre, because it talks on the one hand, it talks about, on the one hand, UN measures, while you would expect perhaps UN sanctions. And on the other hand, about unilateral sanctions, while you could perhaps expect us to talk about unilateral measures. And I would say that I would have titled this topic in this manner for different reasons. However, I completely understand that in the language of international relations, if not in the language of international law, it is common ground to use the word sanctions for each and every unfriendly reactions of states against other states. So let's be liberal on the utilization of terms in this respect, even if, for my part, and I have some arguments for that, I will write it down on my paper, I do prefer, and I think it's less misleading, when we talk about national measures as restrictive measures, and this is the way the European Union names its activities, while when we talk about the United Nations security decisions, we can talk about United Nations sanctions, and they talk there in the UN of a sanctions regime, which is quite acceptable finally. Well, this is not really the topic here. We want to address the question of the articulations between, on the one hand, the so-called collective measures and the so-called unilateral measures. I think it's what we talk about here. And when you come to these articulations, I think you have three hypotheses to address. The first one is when the unilateral measure, the national measure, implements the collective measures, the United Nations Security Council measures. This is the first point. The second point is where the national measures replace the United Nations Security Council decisions which have not been adopted because of a veto. And the third point, the third hypothesis to address, where articulation can mean something, is where the national measure goes counter a United Nations decision. So three hypotheses we will try to address briefly in 15 minutes. The first one is indeed when we have unilateral measures implementing United Nations sanctions. So that's what I call unilateral measures infra-UN sanctions. Here, well, the first reaction we can have is that you have nothing to articulate here, because in fact the national measures are not really unilateral. They are just a mean for implementing a multilateral sanction, which is the case. When you implement the UN sanction, this is a unilateral mean for enforcing, in fact, a multilateral, so a UN sanction. So it could be out of our scope of inquiry. However, we can have perhaps we can discuss 2 points here. The first one is when a state goes further than what the United Nations decides. So let's assume that the United Nations decide to sanction a state and decide of a series of specific measures to put in place as a matter of sanctions. A state is doing that, but goes further, adopts further freezing sanctions against other entities that are not listed in the UN Security Council decision. So this is something happening quite regularly, and it was the case, for example, in the sanctions applied against Iran. The European Union went further than the United Nations Security Council decisions in this respect. So the question is whether these additional unilateral measures would be lawful or not, even if they are not covered effectively, directly by a United Nations decision. My answer here is very simple, in fact. If the measure is not covered by the United Nations Security Council decision, it is not covered, full stop. And so that the question whether this measure is compatible or not with international law is a question that must be dealt with respect to taking into account, if you prefer, international law as such. Treaties, customary international law, unilateral commitments perhaps. That's the standards against which the further sanction will be analyzed, of course. However, I think that if a state adopts further sanctions, going further what the United Nations has decided, it's easier for this state to convince that these measures are countermeasures, because indeed it will have no difficulty in arguing that the other state, the sanctioned state, has done wrong, has done something wrong, which calls for a reaction, and the reaction can be, of course, upon after a thorough analysis, which I will not make here, could be perhaps argued that it's a countermeasure. Now, when it comes to implementing enforcement measures adopted at the national level, while there is a multilateral sanction, the other point to address is whether nationals unilateral measures implementing multilateral sanctions could have an extraterritorial effect. So is it possible to have states implementing UN Security Resolution with an extraterritorial effect? And my answer is no. In fact, when you look at the UN Security Council resolutions, they don't authorize, they don't call for, they don't call upon states to implement sanctions extraterritorially. And this is because the Security Council does not need it. The Security Council, when it decides to sanction a state or an entity, it decides that each and every state member will have to implement this sanction by adopting national measures. So normally, in the reality of the Security Council, the sanction will be worldwide. So you don't need to have one state expanding its jurisdiction vis-a-vis or towards or, in other states in order to render the sanction efficient. You don't need it because every state has to implement the UN Security Council resolution. So you will not find in Security Council resolutions an authorization or a suggestion that states should implement the sanctions extraterritorially. You will even find the reverse, because everything which is asked of states by the Security Council is normally territorially limited, jurisdictionally limited to what comes within each state's power. Now let's turn to the second articulating question, which is when the national measure, the unilateral measure, replaces what should be a UN Security Council decision. So this is the case when there is a veto at the last moment, a veto precluding the adoption of a UN Security Council resolution. So is there something to say in this situation about the unilateral measures that would be adopted in absentia UN Security Council resolution? Now, 3 points to make here. I will try to make it short because time is passing fast. The first thing is that, of course, an almost adopted resolution, which is not adopted because of a veto, cannot have the legal value of an adopted resolution. So you cannot say that, well, it was almost done, so it will have the same effect as if it had been done. It doesn't work. So that's a very simple thing. So that the unilateral measures adopted in this situation will have to be assessed under the criteria of the legality in international law. Is it compatible with a treaty? Is it compatible with customary international law? And will not be covered by a UN decision. But, of course, if the decision was very close to be taken by the Security Council, one can assume that the qualification of the initial breach of international law by the sanctioned states would be more easy to demonstrate, and so the sanctioning states, the states adopting unilateral measures, will have some sort of facility to demonstrate that they are adopting countermeasures. So that I would say an almost adopted decision will help only to justify that the unilateral measures are countermeasures, and that's all. The two other points I wanted to say with respect to the situation when you have an almost adopted resolution is that, of course, in this case, states at the initiative of the resolution not adopted will try to create a coalition, of unilateral decisions. And they will claim that it's a collective decision. It will not, because the collective decision must be adopted by the Security Council, but they will try to create a coalition in replacement. It will not change anything with respect to the question of is it lawful or not, but it will render the sanction more efficient, because the more countries are covered, the more efficient is the sanction, of course. And this is the objective of the coalition, which is to cover the most, the more country as possible, to avoid the target states to be able to escape, to find a refuge somewhere. And the third point is that, of course, if there is no coalition, or if the coalition is not sufficient, some state could be tempted to have recourse to extraterritoriality, just to render the sanction more effective. So the thing is that when you have a UN Security Council resolution, it's supposed to cover the whole world. If you have a national measure, it does not. And so if you want to have the same efficiency as the one of the Security Council resolution, which has not been adopted, well, you will be tempted to adopt extraterritorial measures. And this is exactly what's going on with the United States generally. So that leads me to the third point, the third articulation question, which is when a unilateral measure is going against a UN Security Council decision. So it's very hard to find a clear-cut example of that, on which we could have a clear-cut reflection, of course, but it has been claimed that the United States has violated the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 of 2015 when they withdrawn from the JCPOA, and more than that, when they adopted sanctions extraterritorially to prohibit all the world to implement the JCPOA. So it has been said that it was a breach of the resolution in this case. Now, is it the case? So I don't know. I just have arguments. I don't know, because there has been no decision rendered in this respect, but you can argue. When you look at the words of Resolution 2231 of 2015, when it talks to the JCPOA, it doesn't talk about decision. The Security Council endorses the JCPOA, urges states to implement it, calls upon member states to take actions to support the implementation of the JCPOA. It doesn't go as far as deciding that the JCPOA must be respected. So you cannot have here a breach of something which is not compulsory. But one could claim, on the other hand, that when the Security Council calls upon states to do something, at least it means that the state members of the UN cannot act to undo this thing. They cannot take an action in order to render this aim completely impossible to achieve. You can refrain from following the trend and to say, well, the Security Council calls upon states to do things, I will not do anything. That's something. But acting completely against this aim, clearly mentioned and phrased by the UN, is a little bit more difficult to accept. And it could be said that it's at odds with the commitment encompassed in Article 2, Paragraph 5 of the UN Charter, which provides as follows, and I recall that, but it's something you know: all members shall give the United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present Charter. So it can be said, it can be argued that the behavior of the United States vis-à-vis JCPOA and Resolution 2231 is not bringing assistance to the action taken by the United Nations. It's even the contrary. So it could be said that it's against the UN Charter. There is also another reasoning that we can have with respect to the WTO law. It is far clear, in my view, that the United States, in this case, cannot claim that its action has been taken in order to implement its obligations regarding international security. It would not work, but that's another debate, and I'm sure we will come to it during this colloquium. So I see that my time is lapsed. It's 17 minutes, a little bit too long. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope the sound was good, and that perhaps the three elements, infra, praeter, and contra, will help you to, will bring some elements to your reflections. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you will have a very good colloquium. Bye-bye.